on two parts today. The first is an overview and a conversation about anxiety, bias, and COVID-19. My name is Dr. Dana E. Crawford. I am the director of the Trauma Informed Care Program here at Montefiore. And so this program was originally scheduled about, 4 months ago to be a full day training for CEUs, CMEs, focused on the Crawford bias reduction theory and training that is all about different ways that you can systematically reduce racism, prejudice, and bias. Long story short, COVID-19 happened and we were doing social distancing. I think it was about 100 people registered for the day. So we definitely were over the capacity for being able to meet. So we canceled the meeting, but still had planned to do a short webinar, maybe about an hour, focused on anxiety, bias, and COVID. And then things continued to unfold and we realized that there would be a need for us all to come together and figure out how we could support each other during this process. So the idea today is to give you the theoretical underpinnings of what is happening in real time related to anxiety and bias and COVID-19 and how anxiety and bias are going to impact the ability to fight COVID. And then the second part of this training is a training on how to do a systematic staff emotional support team. And in doing that staff emotional support team, I'll be going through what the actual skills are and what the intervention looks like. Please, everyone, put your phones on mute or put your webinar, your camera on mute. And so we're going to be doing a conversation on how to do a staff emotional support team, the interventions, the skills needed, as well as how you could develop one if you would like to develop one within your area of Montefiore or within your organization. So everyone on the call is not necessarily from Montefiore, okay? And again, this is a good segue because I definitely heard someone clearing their throat. Just a reminder to mute your audio, please. And I can hear people typing. So somebody's, let me see, maybe I can go through and manually mute that person. So when you came on, you should have automatically been muted. So if you double clicked, you may have accidentally unmuted yourself. So just please be cognizant of that. So we're in a new world of webinars. And so often when people are on webinars, they don't use the same skills that they use when they go to a presentation in person. So I've often thought of webinars as an opportunity to kind of learn some stuff and get some work done, right? But what I invite you to do today, because both of these topics, part one and part two, are very serious, is to try your best to give us your undivided attention. And if you've elected to share your camera, try your best to look like you're engaged. So sometimes we think if we're kind of glancing at the screen, it looks like we're engaged, but it's not. And it can be a bit distracting for other participants who are giving their undivided attention to see folks kind of doing this. And so if you do that, folks will be very distracted and you don't have to have your camera on. But if you do have your camera on, you want to think about the experience of doing a webinar similar to how you would be if you were in an in-person meeting. And so I doubt if you were in an in-person meeting, you would be typing and doing your notes and looking around. Instead, you would be really engaged. This is going to be a new skill for us all to practice in the coming weeks because we've all done webinars kind of in the way that I've always done them, where you're multitasking and you're kind of paying attention to the webinar. So as much as possible, if you could look at the camera, if you have yours on. I'm also going to do my best to refer to you as by your name. Social distancing does not have to be social isolation. The other thing is, because we're not going to be able to do the nonverbals in the same way that you would if you were in person, you just can't see people as well. What I invite you all to do is to use more exaggerated nonverbal communication. So if you could really nod your head if you see me right now. Yes, and a smile. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that, Kelly. And so what I'll be doing, I got a thumbs up. Thank you so much. And so what I'm going to be doing is my best to like just check the cameras throughout the presentation. I can't see them all at one time and see my slides. But let's try and stay connected. If you have a question while I'm giving the presentation, just like you would in person, you would raise your hand. And so you can either raise your hand or you can send me a chat. And then when it's a good point in the presentation, then I'll pause and then I'll refer to the question. Okay? We all good? Exaggerated nonverbals? Thank you very much. See? So what we're going to be talking about today, as I already alluded to, these are our learning objectives. First, I want to introduce a model for reducing bias and to talk a little bit about stress. I also want to, thank you so much, Jessica, for the comment. I also want to talk about understanding why decreasing anxiety and bias is going to be a really critical part of us fighting COVID-19. I want to increase your awareness of how anxiety and bias are related to COVID-19. I want to share how it's manifesting and what it's looking like these days. I want us all to learn some ways to reduce our bias related to COVID-19, and then we'll do the part 2 of the training. There'll be a break between the two. The first part of the training I anticipate is about 45 minutes, depending on our questions. We'll have about a 15-minute break, and then we'll start the second part of the training. So, like I mentioned before, this training originally was supposed to be a full-day training that was based on a model I developed through my dissertation about 10, 12, I don't want to date myself, years ago. And it really is about a systematic approach to reducing racism, prejudice, and bias. We are all very, very busy people. And at the same time, we're trying our best to provide the best patient care, the best student care, the best customer care, the best connection with people. But the desire alone isn't going to be sufficient in actually reducing bias, because bias is a systematic thing. So we have to have a systematic approach to reducing it. And so that model is, first, we have to be aware. We have to know, where did we get this bias from? What's the source of it? What is it about? The second thing we need to do is investigate. What triggers my bias? What makes me act in biased ways, think in biased ways, feel in biased ways? And then what does it actually look like? So I could be having a thought, but what does it look like in the world when I have a thought in my head about a particular group, and then I'm living my life and I interact with that group? What does it look like in the world? And then finally, how do I reduce that bias continuously and reduce the impact that it might have on patients, that it might have on customers, that it might have on people that matter in my life? So first, let's start with the awareness of the origins of bias. So all of us as human beings have some basic needs. You know, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic needs such as food, water, warmth, and rest, although many of us may not think it, or we may not have had the opportunity to get much rest these last few days. I know I have not, but that is a basic need that we're all looking for. We also need to feel safe and feel secure in our life. We need to have intimate relationships and feel connected, have friendships. We need to have some esteem, a feeling of prestige or accomplishment, that things matter in our life. And then after all those needs are met, we need to have this self-actualization, achieving our potential, the goals that we set, being creative. And this is really a building block. You cannot have self-actualization if you're starving. You know, it's very hard to be in that space. You can't be thinking about like prestige in your job if you're thirsty and dehydrated and you're lethargic and you haven't had any sleep. So the idea is that it's really crucial that these needs be met in order to be able to have our fullest life, right? So where does bias come in? So, you know, in reality, we don't all have the same access to resources because of possibly our race, or our gender, or our sexual orientation, or the socioeconomic status that we were born into. Some of us were born into poverty. Others were born into wealth and had a lot of access to resources from the very first moment. You know, we know that there are glaringly clear differences even in the birthing experience of women based on their ethnicity. For instance, we know that Black women are 3 to 5 times more likely to die related to childbirth than white women are, right? And we know that Black babies and Latino babies are more at risk for infant mortality. And a lot of these things start because of the system. So I mentioned earlier that bias, racism, and prejudice is often systematic. It's not just within the person. Our entire structures of our society are anchored towards certain people having certain resource and access. Just think about that. If you don't believe it related to race, I think as women, all the women in the room would agree that there are certain ways that things are structured. Would you agree? Seeing some nonverbals, thank you. And so some of our origins start from the fact that every parent, caregiver, loved one, adults in the world want kids to have resources. We want kids to feel safe. We want kids to feel protected. And so in order for kids to have these things, you have to teach them certain lessons, right? You have to tell them things. So I have two roommates. They're 3.5 and 15 months. And so the other day, one of my roommates was like jumping on the couch, and I said, stop jumping on the couch. She kept jumping. The next time she jumped again. And I said, okay, if you keep jumping on the couch, you're gonna fall and crack your head open, right? And so now she might become kind of paranoid about jumping on the couch. And so I've instilled the fear, and probably not the best parenting moment, you know, parenting during COVID, but you know, for her, that fear protected her. Now that is a really concrete physical example of me instilling fear because I was afraid she would be hurt. She wasn't afraid. And it's my job to keep her safe. But the same thing happens when our parents or our loved ones or the people in our lives care about us and they don't have access to all of the information. So for example, if you've had limited information or limited exposure to certain communities, you might tell your kids or your family certain things about groups that are inaccurate. So the other thing is, if you're not necessarily comfortable with change, we know that everyone has different levels of comfort about change. If you're more of a person that likes things to stay the same because that feels safe, those are the messages that you're going to be communicating to the young people in your life, to your coworkers, to the people that report to you, that this is the way that we've done it. And so all of those ways of being in the world are about safety, about access to resources. Sometimes it's about fear. And so as we're communicating and we're learning and we're teaching, over time, the things that we're exposed to start to shape our mind and our worldview. The issue with that is when we have these experiences, we start to develop a really quick and simple way to make a decision. You know, we have to make decisions very quickly, especially in the work that all of us are doing. And we develop these things called a heuristic. And a heuristic is a mental shortcut that allows us to make a really quick decision, pass judgment, solve a problem quickly with minimum mental effort. So it's crucial that I have a heuristic when I'm trying to get certain things done. So for example, a heuristic related to waking up in the morning. So I don't need to decide, am I gonna put my right foot down on the bed or the left foot out of the bed, if I'm gonna like stand up or bend, like I don't need to do all of that. I do it, it's quick, it's automatic, it's muscle memory. So the more that I have in my mind, things that are heuristics, the more I can minimize my mental effort in the daily minutia of life and be able to have a higher level of thinking. The problem with heuristics is that they're not always accurate. They're based on our experiences that can be completely inaccurate. So one of my favorite stories is the example of the mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother making a meatloaf. So one day the child is standing in the kitchen with her grandmother or with her mother, and her mother is putting the meatloaf, this pot roast, into the oven, and she cuts the end off. And so the little girl goes, hey mom, why do you always cut the end off the pot roast? And the mom goes, well, I don't know, that's just like what your grandmother taught me. I always cut the end off the pot roast. And so the little girl went to the grandma and said, hey grandma, why do you have to cut the end off the pot roast? And the grandmother goes, well, I don't know. That's what my mom always did. You have to cut the end off the pot roast. So the little girl goes to her great grandma and goes, why did you cut the end off the pot roast? And she goes, because my pot was too small. It wouldn't fit if I didn't cut the end off. And so multiple generations are doing this behavior without necessarily knowing it, and it becomes routine and it becomes a heuristic. So even though in that situation, it wasn't systematic racism, it was a meaningless thought behavior that wasn't really based on anything. It's just based on like, that's what I was taught. So when we're working in certain situations, the messages that we were taught by about different organizations, different groups, different people of cultural identities are going to be triggered because I don't have time to be thinking it through. So for example, if my family taught me that every single person that wears the color purple is probably going to rob you, and I know in my head that's absolutely ridiculous. There are many lovely people in the world that wear the color purple. That's just not true. But if I'm having a really rough day and I have to get a lot done, I'm working under a time pressure, I'm in a vague and confusing situation in my clinic, I'm getting way too much information at once, like the person is just giving me like this detail that is just like not helping, or they're just not, I'm not able to focus on the task because I'm multitasking, like I'm on a webinar and I'm also trying to get notes done. Then that memory that I have when someone who wears purple walks into my office, I might think, oh my goodness, I'm in danger. And I don't agree with that, but that's my heuristic around the color purple, and it gets activated when I'm under these specific conditions. So when I'm under those time pressures, when I'm under the vague, confusing situations, I don't really know or understand the situation like COVID. We don't know what's going on. There's so much information. Some of it seems really clear. Sometimes it's really confusing. The information is changing. It feels like way too much information about COVID. I get all of this COVID information that I actually don't feel like I still know what's going on completely. And then a lack of attention. So I find myself sometimes cooking and I'm looking at the New York Times, or I'm trying to eat dinner, but I'm also looking at Facebook. So I'm not really actually paying attention to one task. And so all of those things are going to activate and make you more likely to experience bias, prejudice, and racism. It's going to be more likely to activate the heuristic that you may have been taught. And when I say heuristic being taught, it's not just from your family, it's also from the media, it's from the news, it's the things that we are repeatedly exposed to. Even if we don't agree with it, our brains are recording that hate, our brains are recording that systematic bias. So, part of this, the reason that we do this, like, why would you have to do a heuristic? Why would anyone be biased? We clearly are very good people. If you're on this call, you saw the topic, you decided to lean in and to learn more. How is it possible that us, the good people, still are biased? Part of it has to do with our previous knowledge, our experiences, the things that we've gone through in our life, and the things trusted sources share. So what are the things that, on Sunday dinner that your grandma says? You love your grandma. What are the things that your roommate might say? Or people that you trust that say these things that you may not agree with, but it starts to get encoded because it's from a trusted source. We also start to blame others, so it's not me, I'm not biased. Because blaming others is oftentimes we have this interpersonal complex experience, and then we give it universal meaning. We develop a heuristic based on an experience, based on one or two experiences. Also, we blame others because it preserves our self-esteem. It's not me, then I don't have to think about my own issues. I can say, oh, I don't have these biases. It's also a tool when we feel attacked. It really, because we're not always clear in understanding the cause, our own behaviors or other people's behaviors, blame can really help us give some type of meaning and control. And it's also easier to blame others than to accept responsibility. Finally, we're trying to seek meaning during stressful times. So all of these things are just creating this wonderful stew for racism, prejudice, and bias to just grow and flourish. And so we have to be systematic in reducing it. So, bias and racism, it's in the air. If you're breathing right now, everyone's like COVID mask, but if you're breathing, there's also bias in the air. Everywhere you go, it's everywhere. If you just open up any social media, you're gonna see it. And you can be biased and still a good person. This isn't a question of being moral. And many of us may be having certain thoughts and experiences that because we're like good people, we're not articulating them. And we'll talk in a minute about how it might be manifesting. But, it's not a moral issue. If you're feeling some xenophobia, if you're having some of these fears about specific groups of people, it's not because you're a good person. It has to do with our heuristics and how we've been programmed. And so the reason that we really need to understand this concept, because getting back to the topic, not just big picture theory, But we really need to understand why decreasing our anxiety about others, other groups, about COVID, and our bias is a crucial part for us to fight COVID, is because our minds start to get really jumbled. So it's the first picture is a mind that is full of all this noise of bias, of anxiety, of COVID. And the last is a mind that is still thinking about it, but is smooth and in a right current. So we really want to be able to move from our minds being full of all this content to being able to be mindful. And so our current life conditions, the previous I talked about work conditions, but our current life conditions are all the situations that activate bias, prejudice, and racism. But it's not just at work, it's also at home. You know, how many of us, and you can raise your hand, how many of us feel time pressure even once we leave the office, right? How many of us feel like we're living in a vague and confusing time every single day? As soon as you wake up, like, I don't know what my day is going to be. Am I even supposed to go to the work? What time do I have to show up? Are other people going to be there? What's happening in my clinic? Like, I feel like I'm in a constant state of, we'll see, and you get all this information from, like, how many of us are just over all of the emails of information that's supposed to help us? Yeah, I see a laugh there. Thank you, Dawn. So a lot of us are feeling, really sensory overload with information. It's too much at once, and it's not just at work. So usually we get to have a break from this. You go to work, you have all this pressure, all of this stress, and then we go home and we have peace. But that's not what it's been like lately. And so what has started to happen over the last few months, and it's just continued to heighten, specifically, is xenophobia. And xenophobia is fear of another group based on their ethnicity or their race or their nationality. And xenophobia is specifically related to Chinese people, Chinese individuals. Oftentimes, what I've seen in the language that is going around for xenophobia, that it's not specifically Chinese brothers and sisters, but instead it's all Asian, because people start to create a heuristic. They're not discerning, like, is that person Chinese? Is that person specifically from China in the last, like, no one is doing that level of discernment. And I share this because it's not just like in popular culture, it's in academic settings. So about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I don't know, it's hard to gauge time. I've started to describe time as COVID time. So in the real world, 24 hours prior to COVID, 24 hours was 24 hours. But now in COVID world, 24 hours is 48 hours, right? Each day is 2 days lived, because the days are so long and we have so many different things. And thank you, Alexis. She said that is real, And so COVID time makes days feel longer. And so about 4 weeks ago, or maybe 4 years ago, it's the same time, I was doing a grand rounds, and I had talked about, the importance of reducing our bias in a general way. And I had mentioned that xenophobia has really been on the increase, and that this was an important time for us to lean in and support our Asian brothers and sisters. I can't imagine what it was like 2 weeks ago being an Asian person in this country, or just 2 days ago being an Asian person in this country. And I think after, and thank you, Vanessa, for this point, after that, the Jewish community and New Rochelle. So it's not just xenophobia related to Asian populations, but also our Jewish brothers and sisters are going through this. And like, I saw something online when someone posted, and it was, I think she was like Filipino. She said she thought she had like a flu, and she was scared to go to the doctor because she didn't want to be viewed as having like the Asian disease, And so when we talk about how this impacts us, it becomes really important, because anxiety, like our fear, our xenophobia, makes it hard for us to access our professional skills. So after all of the things that happen in New Rochelle, things that are happening around the world, when you're interacting with patients or staff from this community, from those communities, our minds are going to be full, and we're not going to be mindful, and we're not able to access our professional skills. The things we work so hard to develop, that empathy, that is such a critical part, it becomes hard to access that. Also, bias spreads misinformation. So about maybe a month and a half ago, the comment came out that Black people could not get COVID. And so that is some serious false information. And that experience, makes people make poor choices. And then we saw like some brothers getting COVID and everyone's like, oh my God, Black people can get this too. We're like, if ever there was reparations, maybe COVID would let us be free. And the reality is what happens when we have these biases is that it leads to misinformation and people don't get the care that they need to get, and they don't make choices that are healthy for themselves, their family, and the larger community. Finally, stigma and bias keeps us from moving forward. Instead, we get lost in the weeds of arguing about all these different things about COVID and how people get it and the anxiety of it, instead of actually focusing on the ways of like, how do we support each other? How do we stop the spread? And so, for folks who maybe feel like this is a reach and that COVID is not linked to bias, these are just some of the headlines. I think someone just made the point in the chat that, calling it the Chinese virus, like literally, this is a quote from our president: the United States will be powerfully supporting those industries that are particularly affected by this. I'm not even going to say it because it just makes me nauseous to think of calling a disease based on a group of people. And then we start to see that people are being attacked based on their ethnicity. And we're starting to see more advocacy about this, that ethnicity is not a virus. Viruses don't discriminate, and neither should us. We should all be thinking about ways that we can connect rather than allowing ourselves to stay in this space. And so we need a way to systematically reduce it. So I'm going to pause because that's our awareness section. Any questions about the awareness, the origin, where this is coming from, and why it's important for us to be talking about it and have it on our radar? Any questions, you could put it in the chat. I'm going to look through. Anyone can raise their hand. Okay, we got a question in the chat. And the question is, also, folks haven't reacted to Italians the same way. That is a really great point. Helena or Hina, I agree, and I think that that really speaks to the part that, our bias is so ingrained that when we see it in one population, folks are not responding the same way. Thank you. Any other points or questions, comments before I move to the next section? Okay, we got one more. And the comment is, what about fear people have towards healthcare workers when they go home because they may be exposed? And Lisa says, interesting. I hadn't thought about the Italian aspect. Yeah, I think, the fear about healthcare workers, it's a loaded one. That could be a presentation in itself. And maybe in the coming weeks, that may be something I develop. I'm developing new content like every night, trying to stay on top of this in ways that we can just be as fresh in our information. I think the fear and the bias towards healthcare workers, being a healthcare worker is a cultural identity because it's a shorter training. I didn't go through all the different cultural identities, and I have like a multicultural web and we talk about different cultural identities. But in this time, having a healthcare identity is real. And I think that a lot of people are afraid because they might be exposed. And some of that fear is valid, unfortunately. Bias isn't only anchored in the irrational. Some of it is anchored in a kernel of truth. But it's the reason that people are just going to, I'm afraid, rather than like, oh, I wonder what setting this healthcare worker is. And have they actually been exposed? Am I at risk? Am I doing social distancing? A heuristic doesn't have time to ask all those questions. You just say, healthcare worker, run, I'm afraid. That's how the brain works. And that's why we have to have an approach so we can slow that noise down from being your mind full to being more mindful. All right, thank you all for your comments. And I appreciate the nonverbals and your attention and looking at the screen. You all have lovely faces. And so now we're gonna move to the investigation, really investigating the triggers and how bias might manifest. So I call these the ABCs plus P. So the ways that we're experiencing bias if we're triggered and activated. So effectively, if you're noticing yourself being afraid, having anger, irritability, that impatience, you're more snappy, like someone's talking and you totally want to, Seinfeld them, and you're like, yada, 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 okay, get to the point. Anxiety in general, sadness, I think a lot of us just feel sad as we start to move to a place of accepting our current norm, at least for the next couple weeks, months, perhaps. Some of us still are feeling really hopeful, and these emotions aren't necessarily all at one time. I feel like I go through all of these emotions in one day. And then lastly, denial, like, no, this can't be real. This is going to make a turn to next week. It's not going to be, it's going to all go away. Everyone's making this a bigger deal than it is. Behaviorally, some of the things that I've noticed myself doing, and I know that I'm really activated, is illogical cleaning. So I know that my house is very clean, but for example, the other day, my roommate, my 3.5-year-old, my daughter, she like ate something in our house that I know is very clean, and she like offered it to me, and I was like, oh, because I was thinking like, wow, I could get sick. And that experience, it's not necessarily logical. I'm not talking about the ways that we need to keep ourselves clean that are based on the CDC. But I'm talking about like our obsessiveness. For me, like I have now leaned into ways of cleaning that I haven't before. And I was already a pretty clean person. Like my house is spotless. People are like, what? But now it's elevated because I'm very activated. It's also fatigue. We're tired, we're exhausted. And it's social withdrawal, not social distancing. And there's a difference. Social withdrawal is like you're not talking with anyone. You're not sharing what you're going through. You're not processing. You're just shutting down. You go home and you're like, I don't even want to interact with anyone. And then we go into more of our cognitive. We start to have judgments. So judgments like, oh, if that person knew they had a cough, why would they come to work? If that person knew they could have been exposed, why would they do this? Instead, if our minds were not being so full of being activated and our bias and our judgment, we might say that nobody wants to get sick. Like nobody wants to make anyone else sick. No one is saying, yes, I want to be sick. And so when we're in that space where we're triggered, we're not able to access our empathy. And we start to have flashbacks and thinking about our own experiences, and our heuristics become a lot louder. And then lastly, the P is that physiological part. Our hearts are pounding, our mouth is dry, our muscles are tense. We're walking around like a fist, all up in here. A few days ago, I was like, oh, like I feel like I worked out. And I realized I hadn't worked out because I feel like I have no time to work out. And it was just because I was just holding my shoulders so high. I was just like in a ball, like a turtle. And all of these physical reactions, our affective, our behavioral, and our cognitive reactions are all because we're activated and we're triggered by this content. So we have a couple of questions or comments that, when we talk about the ways that we're activated, the other ways of showing up is in hoarding toilet paper. I still am trying to come up with a psychological theory about like how toilet paper creates a source of safety and comfort for people, because I know that's what it's about, but like, why toilet paper? I would imagine for me, it's like, I would rather hoard like lentil beans because that would make me feel a little safe in terms of the food security. But I think the triggers are different. But in general, hoarding, because we're trying to like, it goes back to those resources. And I think for a lot of people who are doing social withdrawal is that, it's just exhausting because we're constantly inundated with this information. And in turn, we just disconnect rather than modulate the relationship and saying, hey, can we just talk about something that's not COVID? Instead, we just don't talk. And I said the other day, I feel like I have COVID Tourette's, where it's just like, it keeps coming out. It's becoming like a tick where I know in my head, I have other things in the world to talk about, but I cannot stop talking about COVID-19. And so that experience, I think, sometimes leads us to want to socially withdraw because we're trying to get a handle. But I do assure you all, I want to instill a sense of hope that, eventually we will get burnt out with talking about COVID because there's not going to be that much new information soon. We're going to like go to the tipping point. And so we're going to be able to engage in other ways and talk about other things. But I just want to note right now, we're highly triggered, we're activated. And these triggers, you know, research-wise, we know that triggers can be our patients and their families. It's the things that they're talking about, it's their concerns. But right now, it's our own families, it's our own environment, it's also from our colleagues, it's administration. Like, I don't know about folks who don't work at Montefiore, but some of the emails that I'm getting from higher up, I'm like, this is not helping me. It is not making me feel connected. I need information a different way. And that's why, you know, I've started doing webinars, because I was just like, people don't want to read anymore. Like, I can't look at another website and click on another thing. My brain cannot process it anymore. Let me go back. The other part is it might come from our supervisors, because our supervisors definitely, you know, have a goal, and that's for us to come to work and to be able to take care of patients and keep the hospital and keep the clinics running. And because of that, sometimes knowing that when I'm connecting with supervisors, you know, they're split. You know, on one hand, they're like, Dana, I care about you as a person. And on the other hand, it's like, we need a professional to do certain things. And it's really hard to balance that out. And the same is true if you have supervisees. You know, I care about them as professionals, and then I also care about them just as humans, and like balancing both of those demands, because caring about them as a professional cares about patients. You know, it's not about the hospital for me, it's about supporting our patients and our families. And as a person who has vulnerable people in their life, I want, if I ever have to go to the hospital or access medical care, I want somebody to be there to help. And so the reality is it's really complex, and all of that complexity is highly triggering. All right, so we got some comments. And yeah, I think the other piece is trying to provide online school for kids, and balancing work and fear is extraordinarily draining. One of my greatest fears for COVID-19 was not the virus, it was that I would have to be home with toddlers all day, every day. I heard the other day that toddler, a 4-year-old, I have a 3.5-year-old, that a 4-year-old asks about 400 questions a day. And my daughter is very advanced, so I think she asks 4 million questions a day. And, you know, I think that we haven't even acknowledged like parental drain. Everyone says it takes a village to raise a child or children, and now that village is social distancing, and it becomes harder and harder on the demands when you're asked to also possibly work remotely, as well as take care of your kids. We can't use our village, and our parents are often our resources. Our patients aren't able to access their village, so people are activated. And so the very things that I'm talking about we're experiencing, our patients are experiencing as well. Our coworkers are experiencing as well. We're all going through it. All right, so when we get triggered, there are 3 different ways we cope, right? Because we can't just, I guess for some of us we can, and this example is dated, because usually I say something like, if you're triggered and you're activated, you can't just like walk out and be like, deuces, I'm done, I'm not gonna be here anymore. I think some people, that seems like a reality. For others that are connected to our values and we're able to work, we still show up and do what we can. But the reality is we still have to figure out a way through this. And the ways that we figure that out, if we don't have a systematic way, are threefold. We move away from the trigger, we move towards the trigger, or we move against it. More specifically, if you're in this avoider mode or they're moving away, it's by withdrawing. You just check out. You might call out from work. You're not showing up in the ways. You might be present, but presenteeism rather than absenteeism. Your head's just not in it. You're not there. You're checking out because you can't handle this activation of the anxiety and the fear that comes with COVID. You can't handle necessarily the bias that is activated, the fears and the thoughts that we're having. So you just don't acknowledge them. You don't process it. You just keep it moving. And that is not our best professional self, because when you're not in that space, you're very engaged and you're able to connect with patients and with our colleagues. The next is the superhero mode, and I think a lot of us might identify with this description, and this is a moving towards. So rather than, I'm checking out, you're leaning into COVID. Like you have an exaggerated sense of responsibility. You feel like you have to do everything. You're having a really hard time delegating when you have a whole team of people that can help you. You're excessively advocating for a really small segment and getting fixated on one specific thing that isn't going to move the issue forward. I was talking the other day yesterday about how sometimes when the hospital asks us to do things in new ways, like they have been doing every 12 hours, I feel like there's a new protocol, a new thing, a new way of doing things. My mind immediately goes to this place of like, well, if they ask me to do this, I can't do that. I'm not going to do this. I won't be doing, and I go through this series of all these things I won't do that I feel like I can't do if it hypothetically happens, anticipatory anxiety. And what I found the treatment for that is instead I ask myself, what would I do? What can I do? And how can I do it? How can I be helpful? How can I do these things in ways that keep me safe, safe as I can be in these times, not completely safe. None of us can feel 100%, but what can I do to move myself to safer? And how can I show up? How can I connect rather than how all the things I won't? And the last piece when you're in the superhero mode is like this oversharing. So it's just like, bleh, like I'm telling you every single thing and I can't contain it because it's like overflowing. I see some head nods and some experiences. Does some of this ring true for you all or who are on camera? A nod? Yeah, thank you for your nonverbals. And so the last is this critic mode where you just given a stank face. Like people say something to you and you just like, and this is the anger, this is the irritability. You might be getting into really heated arguments. I had to make a decision the other day, and I had to just tell a loved one when they were like, well, this is just my opinion. And I said, every single thing you know about COVID-19 is something you learned from someone else. Unless you're an epidemiologist in a lab with some cells, everything is secondhand knowledge. So like, why are we arguing about this? And the person said, well, you just missed my whole point. And I said, well, my point is that I want to love you and I don't want to be angry with you. I just don't want to be angry with people I care about during this difficult time. But it's really easy to get caught into this loop of like anger and tension and fighting and getting sarcastic and activating xenophobia, because it goes back to that earlier point that it gives us a sense of control. It makes us feel like we understand things because we're trying to make meaning out of something that is like, for me, I don't know the point of it. I don't get it. And to be able to accept that this possibly is a life experience that might not have an assigned meaning, but it may just be like the journey, not the destination, is a really hard space to be in unless you make the decision to be in that space of acceptance. And it's an active thought, it's a decision point, rather than like, maybe it'll just happen. You have to work towards that continuously, especially in this climate. So some of our chat questions is, thinking about how to adjust once this ends. What does normal look like? What is life after COVID? And I think that's such a lovely and beautiful question because it does start to instill a sense of hope. I'm not quite there. I've been taking life by the 24-hour pack. It's just like 24-hour sets. Maybe if I'm feeling really sprite, 30 hours. Because I feel like we just don't know, and everything keeps changing. Everything that I thought I knew, things I thought would never happen, would never be said, would never be the way that things are happening outside of my imagination. And maybe I'm just, at a deficit of imagination at this point. But I think whatever instills hope and keeps you going and moves you from mindful to mindful is a beautiful way of navigating. And so the last piece is, how do we reduce this? How do we reduce our bias, the impact it has, reduce our anxiety? I really like this comic strip the other day, and I've been thinking a lot. I just saw this video on Instagram with all of these kids. I say kids, but they're full-grown teenage adults, like 19, in Florida on spring break. And there was this video of this kid who's like, well, I'm not going to cancel my spring break. I'm not worried about getting the virus. Like, I'm healthy. And I've heard that. And I love this script so much. And this is like a series of, this is from an Instagram person. I have their information there. And they said, I'm not worried about the coronavirus, but why don't you use your privilege to protect those who actually are vulnerable? And so thinking about it from that perspective, that it's not only about me, I'm not worried about the virus for me specifically, but I am worried about the world and the community, my neighbors, the people that are around me. And so part of being able to reduce our bias related to, and our anxiety, is to think about how can we use our privilege? It goes back to that question, what can I do to help? I'm gonna take a breath. I feel like I've been talking quite a bit, and take a pause. Any questions about the triggers and the manifestations or comments? And you can send it in a chat or we can hear your voice. Feel free to unmute yourself. Any shared stories or experiences that that you've been having? Thank you. I love your discussion on privilege. I totally agree with you, Dana. Thank you, Angela. And feel free to chime in. This doesn't have to be just a webinar where I'm just talking to you. We're sharing. Okay, so no comment. And so this is called the Letup Model. It's a way to think about how to reduce our bias, but it's about what you have to do inside to be able to achieve this goal. So a lot of times when we think about ways to systematically reduce bias, prejudice, and racism, we think about all the different manifestations, but we don't necessarily think about us as the tool that can reduce bias, prejudice, and racism. So the mnemonic stands for listen, empathize, tell your story, being able to understand the experience of someone else, and then psychoeducate. So I'm just going to kind of walk it through. And I'm going to use an example that happened to me recently. I'll use the example from the Grand Rounds. So I gave this Grand Rounds, and immediately after I finished and everyone was like, yay, we're feeling all warm fuzzy, I played this beautiful video and everyone was like, yes, we can like be better. We can always improve as humans. The surgeon raised his hand and said, it's not xenophobia if it's true. All of the Asian people are going to give us this disease. And so my first response was, shut up, get out of the room. No, I didn't say that, but that's what my heart wanted to say. Like, are you kidding me? You're a surgeon. You're absolutely ridiculous, disgusting. You know, I had all this judgment. I was immediately moving against. But then I took a deep breath. And this process is about going through this so you can engage the person in a way that is more meaningful, or in a way that you're not just so revved up and activated. So the first thing, if I'm listening, what about this triggered me? Like, why was I so upset about his comment? Because I couldn't really hear him. I just heard the xenophobia. And what triggered me was that I have a lot of Asian people that I love, brothers and sisters, that mean a lot to me in this world. And I am absolutely disgusted with the thought of anyone making them feel any kind of way because of the body that they live in. The same is true for my Jewish brothers and sisters, like absolutely not. Like, I feel protective. And so what triggers me about this is that I want to save my friends. I want to save my loved ones. And I absolutely don't ever want to think about a patient going into surgery and their surgeon thinks that about them. So that's what triggers me. And so I have to make sure that I recognize my own experience so then I can actually hear what he is saying. Empathy, honor my own history and pain. As a Black woman in this world, I have felt discriminated about. And so because I felt that way, I am triggered and I want to protect. And that hurt is real. And so now that I'm understanding and empathizing with myself, like, oh, Dana, that one was a blow to the heart. I'm not shaking it off and acting like it didn't matter. That hurts to hear that kind of hate in a public space, in an academic space. Like, my goodness, haven't we gotten past that? And so once I honor that hurt and recognize it, now I can do some real talking, right? Now I can connect because now I've done some personal work. And so the goal in this is being able to make sure I'm hearing the person and not my own triggers. I also need to be able to honor their history and their pain. And now I need to start to prepare in my mind for what I'm going to elect to say. And this is a strategic self-disclosure. So there's a lot of different things that I could tell him about what's going on in my internal experience, self-disclosure, but I want to be very strategic. And the way that I'm going to pick that strategy is by being in a collaborative way. I want to ask myself, is this collaborative? Is it authentic? And am I acknowledging what this person just said? Those are my factors in how I'm going to decide what I'm going to say. The next piece, and I'm going to walk through it in what I said, is that I'm able to reflect on the larger role in the system. I understand my role. Here I am, a person of privilege, standing in front of the audience. I have the privilege of a voice and a platform of grand rounds. In the larger system, what does that mean for me as a Black woman with this power, with this white man in this audience, and what that means in that space? I also have to understand his individual experiences, male, surgeon, white, and all of the things that might be part of his reaction. And then lastly, I'm going to use my psychological expertise to psychoeducate. Regardless of your expertise, you have an expertise in something that you do. You know you and your work. So I'm going to use that expertise to make it clear that I do not collude. I do not join. I'm not going to laugh. I'm not going to be like, hey, yay, a little xenophobia. That was a good joke. Like, I'm not doing it. I'm not colluding. I don't share spaces of hate. And so in that moment, after he said that, and I took a deep breath, what I said was, you know, this presentation is about reducing bias. What you said seems really geared towards increasing bias towards a particular group of people. If you would like to discuss how to do that, I am not an expert in that, nor will I be engaging in conversations about how to increase bias. That feels like hate to me, and that is not anchored in anything that is helpful or useful. But I would imagine for you, being in a world where you're not sure about your safety, finding someone to blame for that might feel like a space of hope or helpfulness. But I want to be clear, it's not. And so in that process, you know, I was able to be collaborative in some way, but I also had to shut it down. I had to be authentic. I couldn't say, yes, I could see how you could, like, that wasn't my truth. I wanted to acknowledge it. I didn't want to give him the power. And so, you know, that experience in an interpersonal way, I think could be a good example. I also want to share how that might look with a coworker or with a patient. And so let me pause though, because I see a lot of comments coming in. Let's see. Oh, just a lot of nonverbals. Thank you all. I appreciate lots of yes, this is great. So if it was a patient, so another example is I was on the train taking my daughter to school, and this woman had a can of Lysol, and she just like sprayed like a good 3 train stop spray, like a whole song, you know, like it was like a 3-minute song on spraying Lysol because there was an Asian person on the train. And so on one level, I'm thinking, do I want to engage this? I'm on a train, I'm in a public space. What is this about? Do I step up? Do I not? I got my kid with me. I can't breathe because of this Lysol, like all of the different levels. And so I had to think about, like, what is it that's making me so upset about it? I can't breathe, and like, please stop spraying Lysol in a closed space. Also, I'm seeing this hate towards this other person, and I want to acknowledge that they matter. I want to say something. I need to understand this larger system, and I also want to let her know. And so in that situation, it was a really quick thing. It's called a micro intervention, where you say something small or you do something really small and flee the scene to leave it so you don't possibly get hooked into a negative interaction. So I just said something like, wow, you're spraying all that Lysol and most of us are going to have damage to our lungs, and that should be the biggest concern. And here you are worried about who's on the train. You need to be worried about your own lungs and that Lysol. And then I kept it moving. I just went to the next train car. So you can do like little comments. Another example is I was getting a patient from the waiting room, and there was an Asian woman sitting in the waiting room. And as the patient came back, he commented, I don't even know that why you would let those people sit in the waiting room. And so I just simply said, you know, that comment is really painful and hurtful. And every single person at this clinic is welcome to get the care that they need to get. And we are not going to be targeting or sending anyone away, including you. And so, of course, we wouldn't turn anyone else away. And so how was your day today? Tell me a little bit about your weekend. So I just said it and kept it moving. I didn't engage in a process. And depending on if you're a therapist, you might open it up and make it a whole therapeutic moment. The level of expansiveness is going to depend on, one, the relationship you have with the person, but more importantly, your capacity to have this conversation. So the Letup model is a model that continues to go deeper and deeper and deeper. The more that I do it, the richer it gets. But on the first level, it might just be micro. You might just do some really small thing and keep it moving. You'll have to practice it. But the idea is to use this internal processing model to build your skill for reducing bias, prejudice, and racism. And so let's see, any comments, any questions? How did he respond? I'm not sure the he, if you meant the professor or the surgeon or the patient. And you can, the surgeon. He responded, he literally said, and I actually posted this, he said, well, with all due respect, I disagree. And I said, well, that's not, what you're saying is not based on science. He's like, but with all due respect. And I said, with all due respect, that's the end of our conversation. Next question. And so, yeah, it wasn't the smoothest moment. And, but I knew he was trying to bait me, and that wasn't going to be helpful for anyone. I wasn't going to engage in hate. Like, I don't debate hate. Like, that's never going to be a debate that I'm going to have. It's like, for what reason? Absolutely. Someone said it must be overwhelming in the beginning to control our reactions when triggered. So it is absolutely overwhelming, because when we think about bias, even when we think about like anxiety, bias in general, but anxiety related to COVID, like none of us got a calendar invite that said, you know, in mid-March, you're going, it's back. So we were talking about the Letup model, and that it can definitely be challenging to do, and needing, and thank you for the welcome back, and needing to self-regulate. You know, a deep breath is a really good approach, to take a breath and a long breath out, and also recognize that you're not going to cure and solve all bias and racism and prejudice in one micro intervention, one Letup. This is a process for you, so you're not necessarily getting so affected. So it's reduction for the impact, but also reduction within yourself. You know, they call microaggressions and bias death by 1,000 paper cuts. It grades on us, it erodes at us, and it keeps us from accessing our empathy and being our best self. And so it's not going to be mastery overnight, or I'm not sure if it'll ever be, but it's an approach and a method to help us move towards transitioning from being good to then getting better to being our best selves. So even though I got kicked out of Zoom, we're actually getting ready to take a break. Are there any questions or comments about this section before we move to part 2 of our presentation? We're going to have a break after we have some questions related specifically to that, and I'll base that break time on when we stop our Q&A. So we have time for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and I can unmute you, whatever, any comments, questions, experiences that folks would like to share. And again, this is an opportunity for us to connect. And these days, I think those opportunities are limited. So I really invite you to lean into this space.